On Christmas Day 1991, Soviet President Gorbachev presented a special Christmas gift to the United States. He announced in a national television speech that the Soviet Union no longer exists. This large country that once covered 22 million square kilometers of red territory has since split. It was divided into 15 countries and withdrew from the stage of history. For nearly 30 years, the discussion about the Soviet Union has never stopped. People have always wondered why such a powerful superpower could die out so easily. People reflect on the mistakes of the Soviet Union, discuss the dark history of the Soviet Union, and talk about Gulag and Lubyanka with relish. But among the numerous criticisms of the Soviet Union, few people have said what made the Soviet Union strong. In fact, the essence of the Soviet Union lies in its strength in competition with the United States. Although it is possible to cite the Soviet Union's Ukrainian famine, Katyn Forest, Gulag Islands, and other black histories, the strong competitiveness of the Soviet Union cannot be denied. The Soviet Union has a lot of dark history, but a country that can compete with the United States for half a century must have done something right. If the Soviet Union is useless, what is the United States that has been in the Cold War with the Soviet Union for 46 years? Only in the early 20th century, Russia was still called the weakest link of imperialism, but it was such a country that became the world pole leading half the Earth a few decades later. How did they do it? As we all know, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two poles during the Cold War. But how did the Soviet Union rival the United States in terms of military strength? The symbol of its power is not its tens of thousands of tanks and nuclear bombs, nor its advanced aerospace technology or unique science education system. These are only superficial phenomena of the Soviet Union's strength, not its root. Since its founding, the United States has only feared two countries, one of which is the Soviet Union. The other is Nazi Germany and fascist Japan. Japan is the only country that has attacked the US mainland, while Germany has messed up half the world. From the beginning of the war, the United States knew that it would inevitably be crushed. During the Casablanca Conference in 1943, President Roosevelt made it clear that World War II would end with the unconditional surrender of fascism. Although the United States and Japan were still strong at that time, the United States was firmly confident of victory. Even today, 30 years after the Soviet Union's demise, the villains in American movies are still often set in Russia. Although Russia's current strength is no longer an order of magnitude compared with that of the United States, the Americans are still afraid of this opponent. As described in The Three Body, the greatest homage in the universe is to kill. What Americans really fear is not the threat posed to Europe by Soviet nuclear weapons, tanks, or nuclear submarines, the Soviet Army, or the inferior nuclear power of the United States to the Soviet Union. America's fear of the Soviet Union stems from the destructive power of its ideology. The destructive power of this ideology of communism is unprecedented. It would be wrong to simply equate the Soviet Union with a larger Russia. The Soviet Union is a nation-state that is extremely rare in human history and has no geographical or national characteristics. It is different from Russia or any other nation-state. It takes the social system as the core and ideology as the foundation of its country. A unique alliance. Although people's views on the international communist movement may be biased by the influence of Western propaganda, it is undeniable that a social system and thought without strong attraction is not enough to mobilize tens of millions of people to devote themselves to it. In the snowfields of northeast China, the cities of Western Europe, the rainforests of Latin America, and the plateaus of Africa, comrades from different countries and nationalities and speaking different languages shook hands and crossed each other. They share a common worldview and are willing to strive for the same goal. It is unprecedented in history that a distant country can systematically support the ruling class of another country without any profit. Bethune-Joined, Orwell, Hemingway, Tito, Neruda, Sartre. Most of these people may have never dealt with Spain in their lives, but they are willing to join the Spanish International Column under the call of the Communist International and come to Madrid to fight with fascism. This spirit is difficult for people in the 21st century to understand. After the end of the Cold War, because the United States dominated the international discourse power, many people natively believed that American values were the only universal values, and democracy and freedom seemed to be closely connected with the American system. It is hard for people today to imagine how fierce the dispute between the two ideologies was during the Cold War. The institutional self-confidence of the United States is not born like this. It is gradually formed through the accumulation of World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. After World War I, the United States began to realize the advantages of its own system, which was further consolidated after World War II, and the victory of the Cold War convinced the United States that its system was a universal value. This kind of institutional self-confidence is built up through continuous strengthening, not innate. Unlike countries with a strong sense of national identity, the United States, as a country composed of multiple ethnic groups, has huge internal cultural differences. It is the values that maintain the existence of the United States. You can criticize Americans for unhealthy life and lack of cultural heritage, and they will even criticize with you. But they must be outraged when their liberal democracy is questioned. When freedom meets fairness, when universal values meet human liberation, this is the moment Americans fear most. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the achievements of the Soviet Union were by no means inferior to those of the United States. At least until the 1970s, the appeal of the Soviet Union and the United States was equivalent, a country created by the so-called working people, without capitalists and aristocracy. Starting from the backward Russia, the Soviet Union resisted the encirclement and blockade of European powers at birth. In the predicament, it quickly realized industrialization through 5-year and 10-year plans. In only 20 years, it became the leading industrial country in Europe. In the global economic depression between 1929 and 1933, only the Soviet Union maintained sustained economic growth. Is this a script for online writing? In World War II, the Soviet Union defeated the arrogant German fascists, and the red flag flew over the Reichstag in Berlin, liberating half of the people of Europe. After World War II, the rapid economic development promoted the breakthrough of rocket technology and realized human exploration of space. The Soviet Union successfully launched the first manned rocket, the first artificial satellite, the first space station, and the first lunar probe. Even in a hostile environment, it still won 15 Nobel Prizes and 440 Olympic gold medals. Although the Soviet Union used many despicable methods, no one can deny these tangible achievements. Yuri Gagarin is not only a hero of the Soviet Union, but also a hero of all mankind. He is unprecedentedly welcomed in the world. It may be difficult for modern people to understand what the existence of the Soviet Union meant to working people at that time, but it brought people inspiration. The existence of the Soviet Union proves the fact that the working people are not inferior. Without capitalists, aristocrats, emperors, or princes, the working people can still create great achievements. After all, in the thousands of years before the birth of the Soviet Union, history was just a rotation of princes and generals. There is a strong proof of this. That is, from Stalin to Gorbachev, almost all senior officials in the Soviet Union came from civilian families. Stalin was the son of a cobbler. Molotov came from an ordinary family. Kalinin was the son of a poor Ukrainian peasant. Mikoyan was the son of a carpenter. Brezhnev was the son of a metallurgical worker. Kosygin was the son of a railway worker. Andropov and Chernenko were the sons of farmers. And even Gorbachev and Yeltsin were the sons of farmers. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had an overwhelming majority of workers and peasants. In the intellectual group, a large number of leftist intellectuals regard the Soviet Union as a paradise for workers. To what extent has the Soviet Union's calling power reached? Since the 1930s, many institutions in the United States and Europe have been infiltrated by Soviet intelligence. Like a sieve, these spies are not bought by money, but are voluntarily formed by a large number of intellectual prolists. The Soviet Union's penetration of the United States reached an incredible level. The Manhattan Project during World War II was so secretive that Truman, then vice president, did not learn that the United States was developing atomic bombs until Roosevelt's death. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman revealed to Stalin that the United States was developing a powerful new weapon, and Stalin smiled easily. Truman mistakenly thought that Stalin knew nothing about it. But in fact, Stalin not only knew about the Manhattan Project, but also obtained information through the Soviet spy network in the United States earlier than Truman. Understanding this phenomenon, we should understand that the United States and the Soviet Union are a zero-sum game of life and death confrontation without any possibility of compromise. If the Soviet Union were Tsarist Russia, he would not need to compete for global hegemony with the United States. After all, the Earth is big enough to accommodate two great powers. Global hegemony is meaningless to the United States and the Soviet Union. In particular, the money and power spent by the Soviet Union on hegemony every year cannot be measured by numbers, and the United States has also paid a huge price. The outbreak of the Cold War originated from the two modern civilizations, the United States and the Soviet Union, which made a choice at the crossroads of human destiny. Both parties firmly believe in the correctness of their own path and regard themselves as the obligation to lead all mankind to the light. To understand the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union only as a struggle for the interests of imperialism is to despise these two civilizations. From 1947 to 1991, human society experienced unprecedented rapid development. During this period, the two camps launched fierce competition in order to prove the superiority of their respective social systems, which greatly promoted the progress of human society. It can be said that in the history of human struggle for thousands of years, no conflict has been greater than the Cold War. Compared with the comparisons and contests in today's world, the Cold War is more like a struggle about who can show better performance. In order to prevent the spread of communism in their own territory, Western countries made huge concessions. During the Cold War, the gap between rich and poor remained at a relatively low level in both the United States and Europe. Europe has established a perfect welfare system, and the cruel exploitation of workers before World War II has been fundamentally changed. As Che Guevara said, "When we leave, they will build schools and hospitals and raise wages." This is not because of the conscience of the West, or because they have suddenly become good people, but because we have come. This is one of the most powerful catfish effects in human history. Although the Soviet Union may not be ideal in some aspects, its existence itself is enough to promote the entire capitalist world and human civilization to take a big step forward. In the field of science and technology, the Soviet Union successfully sent Gagarin into space, established a space station, and pioneered human territory in space. The United States went a step further, implementing Apollo program regardless of cost, and realizing the dream of mankind landing on the moon. In the field of civil science and technology and medicine, the Cold War witnessed great progress of mankind, and various innovations and inventions emerged one after another, such as supersonic airliners. The United States also launched a variety of new household appliances, and the application of each new technology has greatly improved the United States. The quality of lifestyle. At that time, the United States was undoubtedly a real beacon of science and technology, and its contributions in R&D investment, technical assistance to Europe, and deconstruction of the British and French colonial system were all important forces to promote human progress. When the United States and Europe gradually established a universal welfare society, the living standards of the Soviet people were also rapidly improving. Take medical treatment as an example. When Solzhenitsyn was still an ordinary worker in 1954, the Tashkent local hospital was able to cure his lung cancer, which shows the medical level of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's universal recuperation system became a way of life, and the spread of sanatoriums throughout the country became a major feature of the Soviet Union. While guaranteeing the 8-hour workday, the Soviet Union transformed many high-end hobbies into national hobbies. For example, Paris was a hobby of nobles in the Russian era, but it became a national culture in the Soviet Union, which greatly improved the aesthetic level of the people. Those familiar with the Soviet Union will find that many ordinary Soviet workers have second hobbies, such as correspondence, night school, shooting and skydiving. For example, female astronauts in the Soviet Union liked to parachute before they became astronauts. The reason for such a life is that the Soviet Union implemented an 8-hour working system for most of the peaceful years, and even considered a 7-hour working system before the disintegration. In terms of education, you can learn about the abnormal, high-intensity, and high-speed education system of the Soviet Union, as well as the super high level of mathematics at the national level. At that time, the European and American education system also cultivated a large group of masters in all walks of life. Jokes about the material scarcity of the Soviet Union were mainly popular during the Stalin period and the last years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, the Soviet Union did not have a rich choice of consumer goods during the Cold War, but the standard of living was definitely not low. The output of the Soviet Union was far ahead in the world, and the output of wool textiles, cotton cloth, shoes, granulated sugar, and dairy products ranked first in the world. At the same time, the consumption of beer and ice cream is the second in the world. Although Soviet jokes are a precious spiritual heritage of mankind, they should not be misunderstood as a country that lacks food and clothing can become the world's top. From the perspective of social life, the living standard of the Soviet people is lower than that of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, but otherwise, it is basically the highest living standard. During Khrushchev's time, the living standards of the Soviet people improved rapidly, as evidenced by the kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon. At that time, despite the poor appearance of Khrushchev's residential buildings, they solved the residential needs of the Soviets. And Khrushchev insisted that everyone in the Soviet Union should be entitled to free housing provided by the state, while the poor in the United States had to sleep on the streets. This is a very practical problem. Without enough confidence, who dares to assert that his life is better than that of Americans? The social life of the two countries has its own advantages and disadvantages. The United States has a rich and exquisite supply of goods, and more importantly, its operation is more efficient. The Soviet Union is known for its fairness. There is no significant gap between the rich and the poor or class barriers, social stability, extremely low unemployment rate, and no economic crisis. However, the shortcomings of the Soviet planned economic system are also obvious, resulting in a serious waste of resources, long-term suppression of civilian demand, poor quality of goods, long cycle, and slow effect of transforming scientific and technological achievements into actual products, thus gradually lagging behind in the Cold War. Although the United States faces cyclical economic crises and unemployment risks, such as the Middle East oil crisis, its market economy has always had significant advantages. In the United States during the Cold War, one worker could support a family and 2 dogs. This is the best proof of the strong productive forces of the United States, and it is also a golden age that Americans miss. Of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, such good days are gone forever. After all, there is no need for capitalists without threats to always give profits to workers. The planned economic system of the Soviet Union was too advanced, which led to an extreme imbalance in the allocation of internal resources. The military industry has dominated the national economy for a long time. Even after meeting basic needs, people's living standards have been stagnant for a long time, lacking choice and enjoyment, and the poor quality of Soviet products has become a popular topic, but the core of the problem is always good and bad, not something or nothing. In 1979, a satirical film about the minister's car in East Germany revealed corruption. The film describes a series of humorous stories triggered by an East German worker by replacing the minister's old car. Although the purpose of the film is to satirize corruption, it reflects the fact that ordinary working families in East Germany in 1979 were able to own private cars as close partners in the Soviet Union and can imagine the living standards of the socialist camp at that time. In terms of equality, the Cold War pressed the accelerator of global equality. After the birth of the Soviet Union, the level of global feminism has been significantly improved. Because gender equality is one of the core concepts of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, women participated widely and became a symbol of women's rights in the world, such as the first female pilot, female sniper, and female astronaut. At the same time, the West during the Cold War also made significant progress in racial equality. The United States abolished the long-standing apartheid system, and blacks began to enjoy equal treatment with whites in life, which is closely related to the background of the Cold War. The global colonial system collapsed under the joint collapse of the United States and the Soviet Union, and the number of independent countries increased from more than 50 to nearly 200. The independence of these countries was inseparable from the support of the United States and the Soviet Union, and people around the world began to take up arms against colonial rule. In short, the world during the Cold War is in an era of rapid technological progress, rapid development of equal rights, narrowing of the gap between the rich and the poor, improvement of living standards, and comprehensive popularization of modernization. A capitalist dare not arbitrarily exploit workers, and globalization dare not arbitrarily exploit the third world. The era is a great era in which mankind is gradually getting rid of chains. However, such an era is facing the threat of nuclear war. The destruction may be in the next second. The brightest progress and the darkest reality exist at the same time. This is the contradiction of the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, the United States did not implement a crazy plan similar to Apollo. Because of the lack of motivation, the gap between the rich and the poor, between countries and people, has widened sharply around the world. Financial giants such as Buffett and Soros have become global icons again, and the problem of the working class exploited in the process of globalization has not been solved. All this happened because of the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. The superpower that dared to pick trouble for nothing no longer exists. Perhaps in our lifetime, we will witness the record of the US military conquering Berlin, the Soviet Union and Germany becoming an Axis power. When it comes to the black history of the Soviet Union, whether it is the Prague Purge or various Soviet jokes, its black history must be criticized. However, we should not deny the Soviet Union's efforts to promote pride. The role of the process of human civilization, the three superpowers of the British Empire, the United States of America, and the Union of Soviet Socialist States have all played an irreplaceable role in promoting the progress of human civilization. So why did such a powerful country finally move towards understanding? Because, see, the elites of the Soviet Union were unwilling to share state power with the common people. In the Soviet era, corruption among high-ranking Soviet officials was limited to the smuggling of tight goods. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of many oligarchs in Russia made the Soviet people truly understand the meaning of corruption. Until the day before the collapse of the Soviet Union, its army was still very powerful. Everything stems from corruption and unrestrained power. I'll tell you a little story every day. I'll see you next time.